Oh, hi. Didn't see you there.
I got that on video.
Of course. Hi everybody, Adam here. So today what I wanted to talk about was essentially the best books that I read in 2020. So I went back through all of the books that I read, the entire list, and I picked out the ones that I think are most interesting and most useful. I also tried to pick out sort of not just the ones that necessarily that I enjoyed the most, but the ones that I enjoyed the most in specific topics. So starting off, the first one would be what I would call my favorite fitness book that I read this year, and that is Overcoming Gravity: A Systematic Approach to Gymnastics and Body Weight Strength. Of course, I had to look at my notes for this one. This is because essentially in early 2020, when everything was shutting down and I was realizing that I was going to have to transition away from powerlifting and into something obviously a bit more home-friendly, I started reading all of the most popular sort of body weight exercise training books that I could find. And a lot of them, it turns out, were not that great, were mostly garbage, but Overcoming Gravity was one that I found to be incredibly well written. It's very thorough. It's a very big book. I would say that it's maybe not for everybody to read through every single bit of it. I myself, honestly, found parts of it a bit boring. I found parts of it things that maybe you should skim through, especially since I am someone who's very well read when it comes to fitness topics. And so a lot of it was just reiterating things that I already knew, but that, for example, for a beginner would be really important ground knowledge that they would need to know if they were to really fully understand the entirety of the program, how they should train. So it's a really exhaustive book. It's probably the best resource that I can recommend in terms of bodyweight exercises, and it is the most reasonable, the most well-researched, the most scientific. Of course, again, the problem is just that it is also very big, and so of course I just recommend maybe skimming through it or focusing on the parts of it that you find the most useful for you. The second book is called Becoming Fluent: How Cognitive Science Can Help Adults Learn a Foreign Language. Once again, long book titles, I have to look at my notes, sorry. So this one is interesting because one of my special interests this year was language learning. And so with that, I decided, I'm going to be focusing on learning Danish this year. And so I wanted to read a little bit about the topic of best practices for learning a language. And so I read a lot of the popular ones. I read books like Fluent in 3 Months and Fluent Forever. And I think that those all had a lot of good lessons in them. But interestingly enough, Becoming Fluent, while I think it gets lower ratings and I think it is probably less informative of a book overall, it really took an approach that I found more interesting, which is that they talked a lot about the science behind this sort of stuff and basing sort of, science-based practice on how you can actually learn a new language in, the best possible approach. And so I would say that in reality, if you're reading language learning books, Fluent Forever, Fluent in 3 Months, those are also great books. And honestly, these three are very close in terms of their total quality and, sort of the lessons that you can learn from them. But I would also say that this one was just personally my favorite, even if maybe it wasn't necessarily the most informative or sort of the most popular. And I think it gets lower reviews. So yeah, I found this personally the most interesting, maybe not the same for you. Maybe check all of them out, see which you like the most. They've all got very good lessons in them. I've learned from all of them in terms of my own practice for learning languages. The next one is The Art of Living by Thich Nhat Hanh. This is a guilty pleasure. I love anything that has anything to do with Buddhism. I love anything that has anything to do with Taoism. And so, I just enjoyed the book. It's simple. The lessons are not the most deep or profound in the world necessarily, but they're simple lessons that are very meaningful. And that's great. That's awesome. I love that. It meant a lot to me. It's an enjoyable read. It's a short read. I can't say anything bad about it, ultimately, at the end of the day. The next one is The Man Who Solved the Market: How Jim Simons Launched the Quant Revolution. So people who know me may know that another one of my special interests is finance. So this is definitely the most interesting finance-related book that I read in 2020. It's about a guy called Jim Simons who launched the Medallion Fund, which is basically the single best performing fund in history. It has really shocking returns over the years, achieving around a 66% year-over-year return, making the firm over $100 billion. So how did he do it? Sort of the thing with Jim Simons is that he was sort of the first person to do the entire concept of quantitative finance, to really dig into using computers to create algorithms that would do trading for him rather than doing trading himself. What they learned was often that, you're not necessarily playing the stock market based on fundamentals, you're playing the stock market based on sort of human emotion and based on the way that other people are trading and you learning to anticipate that and work around it. And that was essentially the way that the algorithm worked and the way that the algorithm could gain an edge and make money over the long term and ultimately turn out, massive returns. So I think it's a really, really interesting history. It's something where it's just super cool to sort of get this perspective that you don't necessarily see very often. It's really someone who really did beat the market. They say that all the time about various investors, that they beat the market. But the reality is that very few of them actually do. And the other reality is that no one else measures up to this. So a very interesting sort of story, very interesting backstory, very interesting history, especially as well with sort of the conflicts and the issues that they ran into along the way of the process of making this algorithm and making a ton of money. So very interesting read, highly recommend it, go ahead and pick it up. So the fifth book is basically the book that I would call my favorite Danish language book that I read this year. Obviously 2020 was the year that I was planning on practicing my Danish, and that meant that I asked around a lot of my Danish friends and I said, hey, what kind of books do you recommend? What would be some good stuff to read? And so the favorite of all the ones that I read this year was Disbel skrives i nutid by Helle, which translates into English as this should be written in the present tense, which is essentially, it's a fiction book. It's a bit of a guilty pleasure. So this book is not for everybody. It's a fiction book. Not a lot happens in it. It's very much about basically this character who is sort of basically living in Denmark and not really much is happening to her and she's not really doing much, but it's sort of about like these banal everyday life experiences that she's living. And so I found it really interesting. I found it really enjoyable. A lot of people would find it really boring. That is up to you. That's, your own experience with it. But, I'd recommend picking that up if you're interested. Try something new. Runner-up this year goes to the sixth book, or technically the sixth, seventh, and eighth books that I would recommend on my list, and that was the Three Body Problem Trilogy. I tell people all the time the Three Body Problem Trilogy is basically my favorite sci-fi series of, I would say, the past 10 or 20 years. It's really, really cool, very interesting. Essentially, it follows the history of a future history, alternate future history, of Earth as they basically start to get embattled with basically cosmic warfare and what's going to happen in the next several hundred or thousand years of human history. And it all happens very relatively quickly. They sort of go through a lot of human history, but there's also a lot of really cool scientific concepts, sci-fi concepts that are introduced, and sort of the way that they wage warfare in the future is very different from anything that you've seen before. So I just absolutely love this series. I highly recommend it to everybody who is interested in sci-fi at all. I've read it multiple times before, but I read it again in 2020 because I just really, really wanted to, and I was really excited to do so again, and it was just as good this time around as the past two times that I have read it. So highly recommend that series of books. And again, mostly just for my own personal gratification and because I enjoyed it, and not necessarily because it had any really cool or interesting insight onto any topic. So why am I making this video? Obviously, I enjoy reflecting on the things that I've read. A really important aspect of memory is that you need to repeat and, basically remember things over time. The more that you repeat, the more that you recall, the more that your brain sort of digs that deep in and helps stuff to stay there so that you remember it in the long term. And so, I would say that ultimately doing review stuff like this periodically tends to help you clarify and remember the things that happened to you over the past year. And that's really important, especially as we age, especially as we just have so much more stuff going on in our brains that we need to have periodic periods of review to really remember our past experiences and to keep them fresh and exciting for the rest of our lives. What were your favorites this year? I would really be interested to get some new reading material for 2021, so let me know what your favorite books that you read in 2020 are, because I am interested in picking up some new reading material for the next year, especially, of course, if you have anything on the topics of my interest, which includes stuff like finance, language learning, Danish, or just general philosophy, religion stuff I love as well. So as always, I am Adam. I will see you all next time.